So once again, just like we talked about, the EPA was moved to enforce their regulations because of lawsuits, right? A similar situation is happening here. The FDA saying they're responding now from people saying they're not actually doing the job that the that the FDA claims they're supposed to do. So let's go over a couple things they're going to do. One thing that they said they're going to do is they're going to enhance their oversight of the food. So they are going to create a more thorough review process for GRAS substances and food additives, ensuring that the safety data is carefully evaluated. So this is, I believe, what they're calling part of their new post-market assessment of chemicals in the food, such as GRAS chemicals. Okay. So just for the people who don't remember GRAS or maybe didn't hear that podcast, in brief, as Joel mentioned, GRAS is generally recognized as safe. This is what came about from the passage in 1958 of the Food Additive Amendment. It contains the GRAS exemption. What that means is that if something is considered GRAS, it doesn't have to go through FDA approval. It can actually be deemed safe by a quote unquote expert. And then the company can start adding that chemical to the food supply. And they don't even have to notify the FDA that they're putting this chemical in the food supply. And there's roughly 10,000 food additives in, chemical additives in the food supply. So roughly 10,000 chemical additives in the food supply. And it's estimated that majority of these, especially in the last decade or so, got on the market by this GRAS loophole. Okay. This GRAS exemption has become a loophole. So there's thousands upon thousands of chemicals now in our food supply that the FDA may not even know exist. Okay.
So Cena, just so we don't run ahead of anybody here, uh, throw out one, for example, monosodium glutamate, MSG. Would that be considered GRAS?
Yes. So it's a perfect example. Monosodium glutamate is GRAS. And the thing about it is that in studies, we know that monosodium glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter that can damage and actually kill cells, including brain cells. And of course, I'm not an alarmist, right? I'm not saying that if you eat Doritos that has monosodium glutamate, you're going to keel over from, the toxic consequence to the nervous system. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that these chemicals are put in the food supply often without any toxicity testing or real safety testing. And there's certainly not long-term safety testing done. And there's certainly not testing done on when you combine these chemicals together in the food. Nobody looks at that. And one reason is because we don't even know what chemicals are out there because the process is voluntary to notify the FDA and the people. So
Yeah,
I'm
if
not
we,
being.
yeah, if we just take MSG just as an example, in 1940, Americans consumed 1 million pounds of MSG. In the whole country consumed 1 million pounds of MSG. Today, America consumes 300 million pounds of MSG. That's
Mm,
all. That's almost a pound per person in the
mm,
U.S. on average in a year. That's a
wow.
lot. That's a lot of chemical, and it doesn't go through any testing because it's generally recognized as safe, and so it can be put in any food product, anything you want. Just uh, put it in, and so like you said, they don't test. Once it's GRAS, they don't test for the difference between ingesting a tenth of an ounce per year versus 14 ounces a year. That's not it doesn't even hit the radar.
Yeah, no one's looking at these things. And it would be really hard even to be able to isolate it because there's so many different compounds that people are consuming. So the legal issue, right? If somebody going and suing a company for putting one chemical in the food that they think damaged them physically, that's a hard case to prove because we're
Yeah.
in a toxic soup of chemicals. So the onus on the company to explore more safety testing is not very high. And in fact, this is what the FDA has said. So let me not jump too far ahead. Let me bring you along with my train of thought here. Okay, so if you talk to the Government Accountability Office, they will say that when it comes to grass, Congress actually messed up because when the Food Additive Amendment was passed and the grass exemption was in that amendment, Congress didn't declare who's responsible for determining if substances are grass or not. Okay. So, in that leadership vacuum, the food manufacturers started to determine whether an ingredient or a substance that was added to the food is grass. And the way they do that is they hire some experts. So they get some expert to basically declare it grass. And there's studies that have been published that show that these experts, by and large, have ties to the companies, right? Ties to industry. So once they declare that it's grass, it goes directly into the food. And I said that's voluntary. But here's the kicker: the FDA is the one that made that process voluntary. Okay, which sounds crazy, right? Because now you have the FDA saying, "Oh, now we're going to have more post-market assessments of these chemicals." Even though they declared it voluntary for the companies to even tell them if the if the chemicals are in there. And if you look at the FDA's policy on grass, they have voluntary non-binding recommendations for industry. And that's in quotes. These are non-binding recommendations where the FDA actually says, quote, "It is your responsibility to ensure that substances added to the foods you manufacture or distribute comply with all applicable regulatory requirements for substances added to food." Okay. That is the FDA's policy on grass. So my point is this: I'm not sure what's going to change here. Like, even if I was a person who wanted the FDA to get involved, which I'm not, but let's say I was like, yay, the FDA now is doing this huge reorg and they're changing all these things. And now they're going to do all these assessments. Okay, so what am I thinking, Joel? If I'm a person who's doesn't do all these deep dives, but I see these headlines saying,
Sure.
"Oh, largest reorg in history," and now they're doing post-market assessments and they're cracking down on the
Mm.
chemicals that are in our food. Do you think I'm going to feel relieved? I'm going to be like, "Yes, my food's safer."
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The entire whatever persona of the press releases, the whole thrust of the press releases is, man, we're going to get tough. We're going to get tough. And so everybody, so it just you know posturing before the peasants to send the peasants into further drowsiness.